are a little confusing at first, but once you've practiced them a few times, they start to make sense. And so my goal today is to kind of get you really familiar with what is a system process. Sorry about that, little noise in the background. And how you can create them yourselves or modify them. And we'll talk about the different types of processes and kind of little tricks of the trade you need to know when dealing with system processes. Okay, so let's get rolling. All right, so a system process is basically a web form that an applicant or a user can use to submit information. And there are 5 different types of system processes, and depending on which portals you have, you know, you might have not heard of some of these, but they're kind of driven by the different portals. In our jobs portal, we have addendums that can either be attached to an interest type or to a job. It's a way of getting a little more information. And we also use them in volunteer. In volunteer and the jobs, we use the disclosure, and that's the form that applicants fill out that, you know, lets us know if they've had any past crimes or anything they need to disclose during the application process. It also has the hits associated with it, so on certain questions, if they answer yes, it's going to mark a hit on their application and put their application on hold until HR has time to review that disclosure. For our PD sites, we have the evaluation form, which is also a system process for participants to give feedback on the courses they've attended. On the jobs portal, we have references. So references are also a system process. Those are those electronic forms that get filled out by applicants' references. And finally, the last system process type is the reference check. And that is also on the jobs portal. And that is tied to the job recommendation. When it's time to hire, you can call and check those phone references and have an electronic submission of the form, so it's all digital, so you don't have to keep paper copies in a person's application. Okay, so those are our 5 types of system processes. And they're all created in the same place, and they're all set up similarly. So we'll kind of walk through that process. Okay, so to find your system processes, doesn't matter which portal you're on, but you're going to hover over that System Manager tab, and you're going to select the System Process menu, and a screen that looks a lot like this is going to open up. And it'll list all the different processes on your site. Some are yours, some are samples that get loaded on your site when your site is created by us. You can see right here, you can see the name of the process. You can tell what type of process it is in this column, if it's attached to an activity or not, and we're going to explain what that means a little later. When it comes time for creating new processes, we, like most things, we give you the ability to copy an existing one, and that, I think, is really handy, especially when you're building addendums and references and stuff. To copy one that's already set up kind of helps you, I don't know, just makes the workload a little easier. You also have the ability to delete something. I'm pretty sure that if there is data tied to the process in the system, you will not be allowed to delete it. It's a kind of a protection issue, so you don't lose your data. And lastly, this icon over here is the magnifier, where you can go and view your process to see what it's going to look like. It's going to look how to look to the applicant that's going to be completing that form or the reference or anything. So that's what that last icon is for. And notice, you know, there's going to be multiple pages of data. So if you can't find what you're looking for, you might need to scroll through to find the process you want. Okay. A system process consists of 4 main parts. You add a title, and under that title, you're going to set up your groups, so you can group your questions and organize it on the screen. You can have 1 or as many groups as you need. after you've established your groups, then you're going to add your questions underneath your groups. Same, you can have as many questions as you want. You're also going to pick the types of questions and the type of responses. And then lastly, if you have picked questions that are either a radio button or a checklist, you can provide the options that person can choose from when they complete the form. So we're going to talk, so those are the 4 parts, and I tried to make a graphic so you know that they kind of build off of each other. So if you're looking for your questions, you've got to go to the group first, and then open that section up to get to the questions. And same with your options. If you want to get to the options and edit your options, you need to open the group, open the questions, open the options. And for some people, that's kind of confusing, so hopefully the visual makes it a little less confusing. All right. Questions? I know I'm kind of rambling. Feel free to type a chat or unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay. So the title, that's kind of where you get started. It's basically, what are you going to call this system process? And then this is also the same place that you can add either a footer or a header to that process. So the header of the screen, the footer of the screen, to maybe give a little more information or direction to the individual who's going to be completing this form, this process. Like throughout the system on most things, to get started, you always look for the Add button, the Add New Process. You would click that, and it would open a screen, and you could get started. Or you can simply modify an existing process by clicking on the pencil. So this is where we go to modify the title, by clicking the pencil. And when you click the pencil, this screen opens. And you'll notice a few things right away. The process ID, that's automatically assigned by the system, and that's how we can find, we match up records when we go to your process response table. If it's process ID 2 on this site, that would be that it's the certificated reference form. The description or the title is listed here, so this is where you get to pick what you want to call your process. This is where you select what type of process it is. Remember, there's 5, so when you're setting up a new process, you got to tell the system, well, what type of process do I want this to be, so the system knows how it acts within your system. Here's where you get to type in your header and your footer, and we'll talk about this later. This is where you assign the activity, and this is probably the trickiest part for some people, remembering this step, especially when it comes to addendums. And we're going to talk about that in greater depth when we get to kind of the addendum process. So you can come in here, you can make your changes and save it, or you could just simply open it, and if you didn't want to save anything, you could press the return button, and it would leave everything the way it is. Okay, so that is where you go to name or title your process and add those header and footer directions. So, like I said, if you're creating an addendum, you will not update that activity drop-down box, which is this, until you've done everything. It's the last step. So your last step is when you would return back to the title section and then pick your activity from the drop-down. And I'll explain what that means as we go on. Okay, so adding or modifying the content of your process. So once you've established your title, then you can go on and start adding kind of the actual, the guts, the meat of your form. And there's 3 sections, like I kind of pointed at the beginning, or mentioned in the beginning. You start by adding your groups, and underneath your groups, you add your questions, and if the question needs an option, you add your options. To find all these sections, you always look for the little plus sign to expand the selection below. So your groups, when you have them listed, there'll be a plus sign. If you click on the plus sign, the questions will open. And if you click on the plus by the questions, the options will open. And hopefully that makes sense as we look at the slides going forward. Okay, so your groups. I like to tell myself your group is just a way to organize your questions on the form. It can, on the screen, it's going to be a title for that section of the form, and it's a way to order your questions. Like if you change your mind, you want something to come before another section, you could just switch the order of the group. So when you hit the plus sign under the title and it expands to show the group section, this is what it looks like. And it's going to list any groups that are tied to your process. So here's the names of those groups, and then the order you're going to show them on the screen. If you wanted to modify or change that group name, you just click on the pencil. Or if you needed to add another new group, you're going to click the Add button. You can see right here, you also have the ability to delete a group if you're not using it anymore. When making changes to system processes, I always say go with caution, because if it's a form that you've been using from the beginning of time, if you go and delete questions, some of your old data might appear goofy. So when in doubt, let's work with the support team and we can ask your specific questions on how it's going to affect data if you're making changes to a live form. Typos, that won't matter, but if you're going to add or remove data, that's where it gets a little tricky. So just remember that your support team's here to guide you in that process. So if I wanted to add or modify my group, I would click on either the pencil or the plus sign, and then the next screen is going to open. And it's going to look like this, and this is where you modify the name of that group, and this is where you select the order. Pretty simple, just 2 fields that you manage under this section. And when you're done, of course, press Save or Return if you're choosing not to make changes. So once you've got your groups established, then it's time to add the questions under each of the groups. So if I have more than one group, I'm going to have to repeat this for each group. So this was a plus sign, but when I press it, it expands to a minus, and all the things that are below it will now appear. So groups, questions are underneath. And just like the group module, you either add or you modify, okay? On this screen right away, before you even open it, it gives you a little idea of couple things you can look at. It'll list the question, and over here it's going to show the sequence like we talked about, but it also has some options here with checkbox that you can quickly see if they're true or not. This IR means, is this a required question? So if you check that box, that form cannot be submitted until all the required questions have been answered. This IC means include comment. So maybe if you selected radio button with options, but you also want them to add a comment, then you could include comment. And this last one is if you want that comment to be required. You might have a list of options and have one other, and you can say, if other, please explain, and they could go in and give you detail, but you might not want to make that be a required comment because if they pick the upper item, the other items in that drop from that list wouldn't be applicable. So just something to think about what those mean. So if I want to edit or look at my questions, I'm going to start by clicking the pencil, and then this screen opens. And this is where I want to spend some time to make sure we understand, and it's made specifically with some of these boxes down below. So here's where we go in and we can put our questions. So we're going to type out the question we want to ask. Same as everywhere else on the system process, you pick the sequence that this question is going to show up on the screen, which is really nice. If you decide you want to move things around, you can just reorder the sequence. You select the type of question, and in a few minutes I'll kind of go over in more detail what that means. Then you choose the option direction. So if it's a radio button or a checkbox question, you can choose, are the questions going to go horizontally or vertically? It's up to you. And then if you want columns, so if you're going to give like 12 options to choose from, maybe you want it divided into 2 columns or 3 columns. If you don't need columns, you have to put in a 0. It will not let you save your work unless you tell it it has to have some sort of data. So if you're doing a text box, I always just put 0 columns. Otherwise, it will not save, and you get frustrated. The other important thing, when you're using the text box question type, you've got to tell it what type of text you're accepting in that box, because sometimes you might want to limit it. So if you're asking for a phone number, you tell it it's a phone number. But if it's where you want them to actually type a short response, you want to select Other. If you don't do that, it might not record your data correctly in the database because you have to select something from this drop-down field. You don't need to worry about number mask. That one's optional. And then right here is where you decide, is this a required question? Am I including a comment? Is the comment required? And then you would save or return. So let's go in a little, put some more detail here. So questions, when you're doing that question screen, you can also use that field to give directions to a form. So like you could say, for each of the following questions, select a rating. When you do that, you wouldn't add any options underneath it, and you would not mark the question as required because they're not putting any response. So that's how that works. Order is the sequence, what order do you want it to show on the screen. Question type, you have 3 choices. Your question can either be a radio button, which is they have to pick one of the choices, or a checkbox, which means they would pick all the choices that apply, so more than one choice, and then, or one or more choices, and finally text box, where they can type in a response. When you use radio button and checkbox, you've got to remember to add the options underneath that so they have the ability to answer the question. Okay. The direction. So that's when you use radio buttons and checkboxes, you got to pick horizontal or vertically. I always pick it regardless of what question type, just it makes it easier, then I get in the habit so I don't skip it for when it's important. Then like I said about columns, you have to put something in this field. It must contain a number. So if you don't really care, you can put 0 or 1 and it'll display directly. But when you have a long list of options to choose from, it is nice to make more than one column just so that the screen doesn't get so long for the user who's filling out the information. Text type, this is where you tell it what type of text you're allowing in that box. Is it other, which means any like just typing? Is it alphanumeric? Is it numeric? Is it a date? Is it a phone? When in doubt, if you have questions, talk to us about it, but I almost always pick other because that just lets them put in whatever they need to answer the question. Number mask. If you're collecting a phone number, you can select to use a number mask. So they have to follow your format, so to speak. So if I put hashtag, 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 dash, hashtag, hashtag, dash, hashtag, 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 they have to put in a 10-digit phone number. So like when you're selecting a phone number, it's useful to put in a number mask to make sure they're giving you the full phone number. So not, like you want to make sure they give you the area code or whatnot. So that's what that field is used for. It is completely optional to use number mask, but that's what that means. And then we talked about answer required. If you check that box, they have to respond. Include comment, that's if you want to add an ability for them to add text when you're using the radio button or checkbox. And then lastly, comment required. When you include a comment, you have the option to make it required or not. So that helps answer, kind of the questions related to filling out the question section of the system process. Okay, options. So after you create your questions, and if you have selected either radio button or checkbox, you need to add the options. So basically they're the answers, the choices that the user gets to pick from for that particular question. So my question was, would you rehire this applicant? Typically my options would be yes or no. So hopefully that makes sense. So to get to that, you're going to expand or press the plus button next to the question to open the options screen below it, and then you would go in and you would add your options. Plus to add, pencil to edit. When you add it, it looks like this. So you're going to put your option name, which is basically what's the answer that you want them to choose from. You only use the hit box when you're doing disclosures, and that is if they answer whatever question you've identified as a hit, so if they select that answer, then their application is put on hold. So this applies to volunteers and to the jobs. So if they say yes, so the question might be, have you ever been connected or convicted of a crime? And the option yes would be marked with a hit. When they answer that, their application gets flagged. And then this box is the sequence. So what's the order you want this option to be listed on the screen? And the sequence actually plays a really important part when it comes to using custom reports. So if you set up your form in a way that you want to collect maybe an average score, like on evaluations or a reference, you want to make sure that you set up your scores from a low to high with not applicable being 0. So we don't count it in the data. And then see how this goes down. So my highest score would have the highest number. That way we can tell the system to average scores, exclude the 0 because it's not applicable, and that's where the average comes in play. So like if you have a custom report that gives your references a score, it's looking like here. So if you had 4 options and someone scored a 3, you would know that the average answer that your evaluator or reference gave was an agree. So I think hope that makes sense. So just remember that when you're setting up your ratings, it's always best to put your not applicable as 0 and then go from lowest to greatest with your options. So that it looks like your setup score, if you set up an example of 1, 2, 3, 4, it stores in the system as 0, 1, 2, 3. So that's why we like to put your not applicable with a score of 0. Hope that makes sense. Kind of rambling. I can always explain that for each person individually. Okay. So after you've gone through, you've added your title, you've added your groups, your questions, and your options. It's nice to be able to look at what the form looks like before you turn it on in your system. And to do that, like I said before, you're going to click on the magnifying glass, and it's going to open your form just like it would look like for whoever's filling it out. And it's a good way to make sure you've got all your options added, the right questions are required, things are set up correctly, and then you can just return back to the screen and modify and make changes if you need to. So the first part is creating your process. And after you create your process, then you have to go into your system and basically turn it on or tell your system, you've created this process and this is how we're going to use it. And each process is a little different. And so I tried to explain it as best I could. So a disclosure doesn't require a checklist activity because this is completed in their profile, but you do have to go into the lookup tables and set the default to point to your new disclosure form. And I'll go into detail in just a minute on what that means. With a reference, it doesn't require a specific checklist activity because it's under the My References checklist item, but you would need to go into your lookup tables and select how that reference is, select the reference form for the interest type. So if I made a new reference form, I'd have to go into my defaults, find the interest type I want to use it with, and attach it. And I'll show you what that looks like as well in just a second. Addendums are the trickiest because addendums always require a checklist activity. So you create your addendum, then you go into your lookup tables and you create your checklist activity, and then you either add that activity by interest type to a checklist, or you go into the position table and tie it to a particular position. And then after all that's done, you go back to the system process screen and you select that checklist activity from the drop-down. And we're going to go over that. So just remember that addendums have like 3 steps, where everything else has 1 to 2 steps. A reference check does not have a specific checklist activity as well, but after you create your reference check, you've got to go into your position employees table and tie it to the positions that you want to use it with. because you can have as many reference checks as you want, or you could just have one and have it tied to every position. But you can get real specific on your reference checks where your references are only available by interest type. And the last one is evaluation. It's the easiest because once you've created it, you don't have to go and do anything else with it. Once it's been created, it just shows up in the drop-down of options on the course request screen. Okay, so now let's go over in a little detail what I mean by all these different setups. So I've created my process, and now I've got to tell the system how to use this process. When you create disclosures, and typically this isn't going to fall on you because we do this for you when we set up your system, but just so you know how it all works, after you create your disclosure, you're going to go to the System Manager tab and select your lookup tables, and you're going to go into the application tables and open the application default table. And it's where all your defaults that are tied to the applicant side of the system live. And you're going to scroll down to mid-screen, and you're going to find the disclosure process field. And then from your drop-down, that new system process, the disclosure system process you created, you'll be able to find it and select it, and then press update at the bottom of the page to save your changes. That's how we attach your disclosure process to your profile. This is true for both the jobs and the volunteer systems, because you guys both of those systems use a disclosure process. So you create your disclosure, you turn it on by attaching it in the defaults. Okay. Come on. References. So similar to disclosure, once you create a reference, you've got to go tell the system how you're going to use that reference. So same place, you go to System Manager tab, you find your lookup tables, you go to the applicant lookup tables, and you open that same application defaults. And further down that same page, there's a little field called Email Reference Forms, and you click on the plus sign to expand the selection, and you're going to find all of your interest types listed below. And this is where you pick the reference type that's going to be associated with your interest type. So I can go in here. So if we decided to replace our certificated reference form with a new one, I would come in here and select that new form from this drop-down. And then just like before, scroll to the bottom of the page and click Update. So that's how you turn on a reference. Reference checks. After you've created them, you need to go and attach it. Oh, I put addendum, that's a typo, supposed to be reference check, sorry. You'll go to the System Manager tab once again. You're going to select the lookup tables. You're going to select applicant lookup tables, but this time you're going to select the position/employees table. Remember, addendums are with the applicant positions, reference checks are with the employees. And then you're going to find the position, and you're going to click the pencil, and you're going to scroll down to the field that's called reference check. It looks like this. It's near the bottom of the screen. And then you can go and from the drop-down find that new reference check that you've created and then save it, and it'll be attached to that position so that when you create your job request, you can access this particular form, or job recommendation, sorry, went too fast. Addendums, the trickiest of all the system processes. So after you've created your addendum, you've got to go in and either add it to an existing checklist activity or create a new one if it's a brand new addendum. And so you start by going to your lookup tables and go to the shared lookup tables and find the checklist activities table. And when you open it, it looks a lot like this. And then we go and we look to see, is it one that I need to make a brand new one for, or can I add it to another one? And you either click the pencil to edit the old one or click the add button and make a new one. And this is what the screen feels like that you have to fill out. So the activity, this is the title. This is what you're going to call this addendum. This is what it's going to look like on the checklist of an applicant or a volunteer. So that's where you give it its name. You got to put in a sequence to kind of see where you are in your sequence. Then you tell the system what type of activity this is. So this is an addendum. So from the drop down, you'd select addendum. And then from this one is where you go and pick your addendum. So this addendum field, if you click on this drop down, it shows all the addendums that are built up in your system process tab. And you would find the one you created and select it so it knows which addendum you're going to be using when someone clicks on this checklist activity on their checklist. And then you're going to mark it that it's mandatory and show when it's completed and to put in the date so you can know when they did all that. And then you're going to save your work. When in doubt, open an existing one if you need to kind of get an idea of how to fill out this section, how to create this section. I always look at an old one first just to get my brain on straight. And then after you've done that, you have to either, so you created the new checklist activity, then you have to either attach that addendum to an interest type or a job. And the way you do that is, if you want it to be the addendum to be tied to a checklist, so like this is an addendum that all coaches do, you would go to the lookup tables, and under those same shared lookup tables, you're going to click on the table called checklist. We were just in the table called checklist activity. Now we're in the table called checklist. And this table is used to identify the items that appear on a checklist based on interest type. And it's real simple. You would go and click the add button, and you would first tell it what interest type you're talking about. So if this is for my certificated interest type, and then I would go find that addendum or that checklist activity, pardon me, from my drop down, and then I would attach it. So if I made this addendum for all classroom teachers and I want it to go for everyone who says they want to be a teacher, this is how I get that to show up on their checklist. And then I save it. If I want it to be tied by job, I make the activity first, and then I go into my positions table. So remember, it's under the lookup tables, applicant lookup tables, positions applicants, find the position, click on the pencil, and scroll down to near the bottom 2/3 of the screen, and you'll find the field called addendum, and then you can pick from that drop-down box the addendum you created, and then save it. And so then now when someone applies for this bus driver job, the bus driver addendum will automatically show up on their checklist when they click the apply button. And then the last and most important step when dealing with addendums. So I've made the checklist activity, I've added it to the checklist, or I've added it to the appropriate position. I come back up to system processes, and I go down to and I find my process, I open the title, and I come down to this activity section. And this is where I can now find that checklist activity I created from the drop-down screen and point this process to that specific activity, and I save it. A lot of people get the first few steps down great, but they forget this final piece. And I know it's weird because you create the process, you set it up in the system, you make your checklist activity and everything, but you have to then one last time come up here and point it. And basically this is where you finally turn it on when you're dealing with addendums. For all the other processes, so if it's a disclosure, I think there's an activity that says disclosure, or you can leave them as none if you need to, except for references. You should pick, it says my references, and I'm going to send you detailed directions that help explain that even a little better. But if you're confused, it never hurts to open an existing form on your site, a process to help kind of hopefully make it make more sense by looking at an example that's already there. Okay. Whether you're setting up a disclosure process, a reference check, evaluation, or an addendum, the first few times it's difficult, it's confusing. Don't stress. After you've done it a few times, it becomes pretty easy, but just remember that your support team is here to help you with this activity. We love to create system processes. And I know for some of you, it's just overwhelming and you'd rather just send us stuff and we make it for you. That is totally cool and we love it. But we also know that there's a good portion of you that like to do this yourself. And so that was kind of my goal today. I hope it made sense on what you need to do. I guess of everything, the biggest things to remember, to scroll up, is there are 4 parts. And remember that to get to them, you have to, they're all underneath each other. You know, so if you need to get to your options, you got to start by finding the title, opening the group, opening the question, opening the options. And then when it comes to addendums, or with actually all processes, after you've created it, then you have to tell the system how to use it. And, you know, whether it be an addendum or whatever. When we get off the webinar, I am going to send all of you a copy of my PowerPoint. And in addition to that, I revamped our directions on system processes. And hopefully it goes in, it actually goes into more detail than the PowerPoint, and hopefully answers or is clear on what all those little details are. Like it walks you through from start to finish with the addendum, where you attach it, where you go, and all those steps. So I will send that off to everybody, and hopefully that helps. And as always, remember the support team's here to support you and to help you with the process, system, you know, with anything in your system. But like, I hope that helps. I know a lot of people get confused just right here on finding how to edit things, and how that you have to kind of go. It's everything builds off each other, under each other. It's a web-based form. It doesn't work like Microsoft Word. It's got its own little funky way of being established in the system. Questions? Feel free to unmute yourself, and I'll do my best to answer or to put in a chat. Thank you, Diane. We love working with you. Trying to think here. Yeah, when I first learned system processes from Sherry, I was aghast. I was like, oh, this is so overwhelming. And now I can do it in my sleep. So don't stress. It's not that hard. The biggest thing is when you want to change some of your bigger processes in your system, talk to us about what will happen, you know. So if I'm going to go and change my disclosure form, here's a good example. So I've got a disclosure form, and I've decided, you know what, we want to start over and put a brand new one in. All the old data will be there, but you can't access it like you used to, because when you go and click on disclosure, if an applicant answered the existing disclosure process, they're going to be blank because of the way it's stored in the system. The data will still be there, but it won't be viewable like you're used to seeing it. So those are really important things when it comes to big changes with your system, to bounce things off with us, and we can tell you pros and cons and how it'll work so that you don't get frustrated. We've had some districts go in and they will have a addendum and they decide to add to it, which is great, you can do that. But then they're like, well, why do some of my old applicants not have responses for these new questions? Well, you added those questions after your process was live. And so you just got to be aware of that, because the data is stored in the database and it doesn't actually get put into a paper form or a PDF until you actually click that button in their documents, and it's just data floating around. And so it doesn't store it the old way on the old person. It always looks for the most up-to-date responses and then builds it right then at that second. So there's just some little quirks that sometimes people get hung up on. But like I said, we can help explain that to you if needed. So that's my spiel. I'll stick on the line so if people want to ask questions or not. Otherwise, that's what I've got for you today. Thank you, as always, for joining in. It's always a pleasure to get to work with you guys and do these webinars. I hope you're learning some new skills or getting clarification on things. And if you have ideas for webinars you want to see, shoot me an email, because I would like to be presenting material that's useful to you and not just, you know, I try based on what we hear via support or stuff to come up with these, but if there's something I'm missing, let me know, because I'm sure if you want it, other people want it too, and we can work on getting that for the future.